Namaskar and welcome to this exciting episode of Sattology, debunking mythology. Sattology means science of truth or study of truth. Opposite of that is mythology, which means science or study of fake lie or imagination. We have all seen that how history builds identity. And one of the most important topics is history, even though people may think of it as unemployable and difficult to work, it's not a skill, but still it is the one which builds identity for the masses. So therefore history is important, and especially Sattology, not the mythology part of the history. So I have a very special guest. You've heard him many times on our show, and he's a very famous journalist, French journalist from India. So let's welcome Carpentier.
Namaskar.
Did I pronounce your name properly?
You did on the third attempt.
Because I've written your name in Devanagari, so I know how to pronounce it.
Good, yeah.
Devanagari, you can't go wrong.
Exactly. It's all phonetic, so you can see exactly what you are saying.
Can't go wrong. Yeah. Everything else you can go wrong, but not in this. It's like I read it Come. Like last time I spoke to you, Come Carpentier.
Right.
So he comments on most of the current issues as well as very insightful articles he writes. You can follow him also. So the question comes in the American media. We had spoken last as well. We'll talk about the American media. Again, we'll go there. Most of the media was gleefully listening to what was happening in the special military operations in Russia and how Russia is getting defeated, Russia is getting this. And we were also hearing reports directly from Russia that they are not using the full might of the Russian military forces. If they would have used this method from the beginning, this war would have ended 3 or 4 months back. But because they were reserved, they did not attack any buildings, they did not attack any civilian infrastructure. They only were focused on their military targets on the eastern side of the Ukraine. So, but now we see that Russia has like opened up their barrels and they're saying, okay, let's take it on. So how do you see the situation from your side of the world?
Thank you, Aditya Ji, and it's nice to be back with you. We have talked about this issue for a few months now, and I'm always reminded of the way that both world wars began in the last century, because each time there were provocations, reactions on both sides, escalation, and finally both these wars became universal. That's why we call them world wars. And there is a growing awareness now that this war is also becoming a global war. Because on the one side, you have the Western Bloc, NATO countries primarily, and their allies. And on the other, you have Russia, China, Iran, increasingly. And then you have outliers, countries that refuse to get involved directly, such as India, India, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, African countries, South American countries, essentially the BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization member countries. Now, as far as this war is concerned, Russia called it a special military operation, and this provoked the ire and the sarcasm of many in the West, because they said, why don't they call it a war? Well, if you notice the history of the last half a century, you realize that very few wars were declared cold wars. Most of the time they were called operations. I mean, the US fought 2 wars in Iraq and called them both operations, Desert Storm, and all sorts of fancy names. Same happened in Somalia, same happened in Afghanistan. So Russia has followed the book in this case, which is a contemporary definition of war, which is not a war, because if you declare war, which used to be the way it was done until World War II, then you have to call, you have to get approval from the legislative branch of government, which can cause problems in some cases. So the easiest is to bypass that. Now, back to what we are dealing with in Ukraine, the so-called special military operation was intended, and Russia said so from the beginning, to eliminate some openly neo-Nazi paramilitary units, which were stationed in Ukraine, right on the border with Russia, and which were bombing regularly the dissident territories of the Donbass, which are inhabited by Russian speakers who did not accept the government of Kiev because the government of Kiev was, as we know, originally set up in 2014 on the back of a coup which overthrew the elected president Yanukovych, who had the support of the eastern regions. So you have that long-standing division between Western Ukraine, which was primarily part of the Austro-Hungarian and Polish empires, and Eastern Ukraine, which was very much part of Russia, all the way to Kiev for the last several centuries. So between these two, halves of Ukraine, you have had long-standing disputes and disagreements and a lack of national unity. And the current situation is the result of that growing hostility and distrust between the two ethnic populations. Actually, Western Ukraine is not homogeneous either, because you have Poles, you have Hungarians, you have Romanians, and you have other minorities. But anyway, to make it simple, let's say that Western Ukraine generally is pro-Western, and it was only integrated into Soviet Ukraine after World War I and furthermore after World War II, primarily by Stalin, whereas Eastern Ukraine has always seen itself as Russian, and so has Crimea. So now what we have is a civil war between the two Ukraines, with Russia backing the East and the West backing Western Ukraine. Now, when the Russians came into Ukraine, they said, we want to eliminate these neo-Nazi paramilitary forces, which enjoy the support of the Americans, the British, and NATO in general, because they are right on our borders and they are openly talking about threatening Russian territory. Now, this has been hotly disputed, the West saying not at all, Ukraine is peaceful and they didn't want to hurt the Russians, but Russians have another reading of that. And as you know, whenever a war begins, the two sides have different readings and everyone accuses the other of being wrong. And that's how you sometimes cannot stop the war, because nobody is listening to the other side. However, we must say in defense of the Russians that they went rather softly as wars go for the first few months. They basically tried to push back the Ukrainian troops, which were actually attacking the Donbass populations. And they tried to work out a deal with the Kiev government through the mediation of Turkey, since the West was basically not interested in mediating. And of course, an agreement was struck in April, whereby the Russians were to pull back from the territories around Kiev, which they had taken over, and the Ukrainians were to negotiate the implementation of the Minsk agreements, which guaranteed the federal structure of Ukraine with wide autonomy for the eastern territories, Donbass. Crimea was to remain Russian. And there was to be an international guarantee for the territorial integrity of Ukraine under a federal status, and Ukraine was to be neutral, like Finland and Austria are. It wasn't to be a member of NATO, which, by the way, was the original agreement made between Gorbachev and Bush when the Soviet Union came to dissolve the Warsaw Pact and gave up military occupation of Eastern Europe. That agreement was broadly respected by Russia, but it wasn't respected by the NATO powers, which insisted that they should essentially take over under NATO umbrella all the Eastern European countries, which used to be part of the Warsaw Pact, and even eventually former members of the Soviet Union, like the Baltic states, Georgia, possibly Azerbaijan, and Belarus, and of course Ukraine, which was the biggest prize. Especially because through Ukraine and Crimea, you control the Black Sea. So all that led to a great deal of tension between Russia and the NATO bloc, led by the United States and Britain, and it has led to the current war. So there is definitely hypocrisy on the part of the West when they claim that the Russian invasion was unprovoked, unnecessary, and unjustified, because the facts are that Russia might have acted differently, and we might all wish that it had. But as you know, whenever a war occurs, we all think that whoever is fighting should not fight. We all agree this is a common sense opinion, but still wars take place, and we cannot claim that Russia has somehow invented war. I mean, look at the last 30 years and how many wars were started by Western countries. Then we hear about the sacredness of borders. Ukraine should not be broken up. There should be no piece of land that used to be Ukrainian that is taken over by Russia. However, a very different standard was applied to Yugoslavia when it was broken up, and then eventually when Kosovo was also carved out of Serbia, because the West felt that Kosovo had a right to be independent. And the same has happened to other countries. I mean, look at Sudan. South Sudan was carved out of Sudan because it has a lot of mineral wealth, and certain countries felt that it would be good to deal with Southern Sudan without having to deal with Khartoum, which was seen as being part of the Arab bloc and which had a tradition of being pro-Russian. So you see, all this is geopolitics. There is no morality or ethics in that whole thing. You can paint it in any colors you want. The fact is, it's all about raw power and who wins. And the Russians know that very well. And of course, the West is trying to talk the language of human rights, democracy, the free will of people. But then if the free will of people has to be respected, then there is reason to recognize the referendums which have been held in Crimea in 2014, and a few weeks ago in the 4 territories that Russia is currently occupying in eastern Ukraine, and which it has annexed. So I think this is a very long reply, so I will stop there.
You correctly said the name, why they chose the name Special Military Operation. And now I'm just amazed at how media, it's like a shows, they are the shows, TV shows, entertainments. So they are now not taking it so seriously again. But somehow the Ukraine, I don't know about the Ukraine leadership, like why they want to destroy their own country. This region annexation would not have happened with Russia if they would have accepted the demands and just quietly made a peace treaty. But it did not happen. Like, who was instigating them all the while?
Very clearly, it was the NATO powers, and primarily Britain and the United States, which are the real leaders of NATO. The Western European countries have been meekly following along with their own agendas, but they have had to subordinate their own agendas to the larger NATO military and strategic goals. And it is very clear that the West was very adamant that Russia should not have any major connection with Ukraine, in the sense that Ukraine should be detached from Russia, with which it has a 1,000-year-old symbiosis, and it should be attached to the West in every possible way, first through NATO and then through the European Union. This was said on many occasions by Western leaders, and it was part of the very old Western strategy, which goes back at least a couple of centuries, to try to keep Russia away from the open seas, that is the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea. And this became a very major issue in 2014, because as we all know, at that time, Russia intervened to detach Ukraine and the Donbass from the new Kiev regime, which, I repeat, was brought to power with major American financial and strategic support after Yanukovych was overthrown. Now, those who say that Russia is unreasonable and tyrannical should remember that at that time, there was a possibility for Russia to take over all of eastern Ukraine, at least, because Yanukovych was the legally elected president. And when he fled Kiev, because he was threatened with assassination, and as you know, a lot of the protection had been destroyed by armed insurgents who had killed a lot of people from the regular police. So as a result, Kiev was in turmoil. The putschists were in control, and Yanukovych fled. So it would have been possible for Russia to simply declare that they were protecting the legal government and that any Ukrainians who didn't want a putschist government were welcome to support Yanukovych, whom Russia would in turn support. However, Russia didn't do that. It obviously facilitated the accession of Crimea to Russia, and it said that it would admit the declaration of autonomy or independence by the two Donbas republics, self-proclaimed republics, Lugansk and Donetsk. And this is where it pretty much stopped. Then Russia agreed to negotiate the Minsk agreements, and therefore there was no intention from Russia's part to annex all of Ukraine or take it over, which they probably could have done at the time because Ukraine was in no way military equipped to resist Russia. Since it didn't do that, however, Russia paid the price because for 8 years between 2014 and 2022, the West armed Ukraine covertly, and in fact in breach of agreements, since Ukraine is not part of NATO, yet they made it de facto part of NATO. And there is a fact that most people don't know, Americans or Europeans, but that the Russians remember. It is that when the agreements of the peace were made in 1945, at the end of World War II, between the Soviets, the British, and the Americans, the agreement was made that both sides would retain the legal authority to intervene in any country in their respective sphere of influence, which would be considered to pose a risk for the peace of Europe. That implied that on the Western side, the Americans and the British could intervene to restore governments to their liking, let's put it this way, if, for example, there was a communist revolution or takeover, or if, let's say, the Nazis came back to power. So that concerned the western part of Europe, which became part of NATO. On the other hand, the Soviets, under Stalin at the time, had the same right to topple any government in the Eastern European countries, Romania, Bulgaria, Poland, Czechoslovakia, you name them, Eastern Germany, if, for example, a Nazi government or maybe just a pro-Western government would come to power. And this is how the Russians justified, or rather the Soviets, justified their takeover of Hungary in 1956 and of Czechoslovakia in 1968. And that is why in both cases, the West did not intervene. Why? Because Russia was acting in its own, you might say, mandated territory. Now, that may seem terribly unfair, but that was the agreement. And obviously, this applied even more to the member states of the Soviet Union. There was no question that the Soviet Union would tolerate one of its member republics breaking away and going the Western way. So if you want to follow the letter of the law, the Russians have the right to take over Ukraine, to change a government which is declaredly hostile to them and which has become de facto a member of NATO, where the Americans might actually place even nuclear missiles, or at least strategic missiles, right at the border with Russia. Naturally, the West will tell you, oh, this is nonsense. We are well past this whole time. There is no more Soviet bloc and Western bloc. So we are all friends now and the world is one. But of course, that is very cynical because NATO is very much there and NATO has been expanding nonstop. And therefore, there is no question that NATO has ceased to exist and that every country is free to do what it wants. So in principle, I mean, if you want to look at it from the Russian perspective, they have a right to prevent a country like Ukraine from becoming an enemy on their border. And the West can say all they want about it. But likewise, if, for example, Spain or Italy were to become, let's say, a communist state or a neo-Nazi state, we all know that, number one, they wouldn't be allowed to do that. And number two, if they try to do it, then there would be some intervention from the Western military alliance. So much so that the Americans kept, with the British, and even keep today, a secret network of agents and bases throughout Western Europe, which is called, it was called Operation Staying Behind. In some countries like Italy, it's called Operation Gladio. In Denmark, it's called Absalom. And this is basically an American-British joint operation to make sure that none of those countries would go either communist or Nazi. Of course, now there is little danger of that happening. But imagine one of those countries like Italy becomes very radical and, far right, or the same that's happening to Sweden now. Well, technically, if these new leaders in such countries are elected, then obviously they have to be controlled. And if they become too much of an annoyance, then you would expect the NATO alliance to react in some way, either covertly or overtly. So all I'm saying here is laying the background for the operation of the Russians in Ukraine. And that's why they tried to keep it relatively low-key for the first few weeks, and they tried to strike a deal with Ukraine quickly. But since the West was intent on creating an all-out war, now Russia has essentially brought out the big guns and said, all right, if you want us to do that, we can basically level Ukraine militarily in a few days. And then Ukraine will have no electricity, no water, no bridges, no passable roads, no railways. How will they keep fighting us then? Otherwise, it's all very good to keep losing one city or a village one day and regaining it the next day and keep on killing people on both sides. But if we want to stop this quickly, we can. And then if NATO wants to intervene, then it can very quickly go nuclear. So that's where we are now. And to answer your question, the essence of your question about why the Ukrainian government is so stubborn about it, well, I did answer it. The Ukrainian government has a nucleus which is neo-Nazi and which believes that it's either victory or death. They are reacting like Hitler in World War II, that you cannot defeat us, we will fight to the last man, even if the country has to perish. It's better that way than to become once again a satellite of Russia. So when you are dealing with that extremist logic, you can understand why there is no interest on the part of the hardline elements in Ukraine in settling for some sort of a peace, which at least would preserve the essential part of Ukraine and would make the country viable. You will again, this is what you hear every time. How can you say such a thing? There are no Nazis in Ukraine, or they are a very small minority because Zelensky is a Jew. And therefore, how could he be the head of a Nazi state? Well, the Russians have answered that. And I could simply say that Zelensky is a puppet. He is an actor who was playing, naked in supermarkets, doing things to frozen chicken and playing the piano with, I'll let you imagine with what. And this was his career. And then at one point, he was picked up by a very, very wealthy Ukrainian called Kolomovsky. And Kolomovsky, who is an oligarch of very dubious reputation, decided to make Zelensky a sort of a hero. So he brought him as a lead actor in a very successful TV series, which showed a very honest, simple man becoming president of Ukraine and essentially saving the country by eradicating corruption. Ukraine is known as the most corrupt country in Europe, at least. Now, this was a phenomenal success. And when Kolomovsky set up Zelensky as a candidate for the presidency in a political vacuum, because the previous president had an approval rating below 10%, Zelensky was practically the only man, and he promised to make peace with the Russians. He said, I have no animosity with the Russians. We all speak Russian. This is, in fact, our first language. Why should we fight the Russians? Let's make our Russian fellow Ukrainians safe and happy, and let's give them what they want. So on that ticket, he was elected. But soon after, whether he meant to or whether he was forced to, he became a puppet of the hardline Ukrainian ultranationalist who said, no way, we are not going to implement the Minsk agreements because we do not want to confer any federal autonomy to the pro-Russians. They are subhuman, they are not real Ukrainians. We want a pure ethnic Ukrainian nation. And basically, they are nostalgics of the days when Ukraine was allied with Nazi Germany and when they provided Nazi SS divisions to the Germans to fight the Russians, the Poles, and all the enemies of the Reich. Actually, the Ukrainian SS divisions committed massacres in France when Germany was occupying France. So this used to be very well remembered. Now they are trying to forget it, but it's a fact. And if you look at the photographs of many of the Ukrainian military and paramilitary soldiers and leaders, you will see some of them sporting Nazi insignia. So there is no question that they are Nazis. Of course, some now Western leaders will say, yeah, but they are sort of nice Nazis. They are just pleasant enough. They are fighting for their country. Well, you can say what you want. You might say that they are not so bad, but they are still, they are nostalgic of the Nazi era, and that has its own implications. So, clearly the fight between Russia and Ukraine is ideological, territorial, strategic, you name it what you want, but it is a real issue for the Russians. And of course, it's a matter of life and death for the Ukrainians. But unfortunately, the leadership of Ukraine doesn't seem to care about the welfare of ordinary Ukrainians. They just think that their job is to fight them forever, to fight the Russians forever at the cost of their own people. And this seems to be also the advice given to them by the West, especially by the Americans and the British. Keep fighting, we'll keep funding you, and maybe that way we can exhaust Russia, Putin will be forced to go, and maybe Russia will collapse, and so we'll have a big victory for the West. I mean, this is essentially the agenda. And of course, Russia does not want to accept that agenda.
It's very ironical that a chosen president, or maybe imposed president or created president of a country, will take such kind of steps which are almost like a suicide for his nation. And Ukrainian history will record that for pleasing somebody else, a president destroyed their own country. That's how the history will say it. That Russia was asking for simple things like guarantee for non-NATO participation, and they could not accept it. Just like the US won't accept Cuba or Venezuela to be armed with all kinds of weapons, Russian weapons, and Russian special forces, training them. And so one last question which has come from the audience, actually. The question is, what is the India's role and the France role? Because they are seeing division in the European Union. So do you think that the European Union is now getting divided, and because of gas shortages and other things? And what is the position of India?
To start with India, I think, is one of the countries that has taken the soundest decision. It has said that peace should be negotiated, both sides' needs should be respected, and that it is completely unreasonable for Ukraine to want to defeat Russia. It's a bit like, Nicaragua trying to defeat Mexico or even the United States. The only honorable agreement can be a peace made, which obviously would be in some way to the advantage of Russia. But let's face it, reality is what it is. On the other hand, contrary to, there are some countries that have been much more supportive of Russia, such as North Korea or even Iran, which is actively participating in the military effort of Russia. Some other countries have offered support. India has stood above the fray, said that we cannot support war, but at the same time, we cannot condemn the country simply as a unilateral guilty party. If you look at China, for example, China openly has said that they want peace, they want a settlement, but at the same time, they have obviously been supporting Russia economically because it also supports China's economy, and it offers many advantages. Privately, I am told that President Xi Jinping has told President Putin, make sure you defeat the Ukrainians and the West, because we need the West to get a lesson. We don't want them to achieve some sort of a settlement which leads to a draw. You know what I mean? Because again, the Chinese have no interest in having the West win in any way, because that would make the US primarily, but its allies as well, much more demanding and probably arrogant with China as far as what they expect China to concede to them. So clearly a weakened West is also in the interest of China. So India has not gotten into these considerations, but clearly India feels that Russia is a country that cannot be ignored. It's one of the key countries in the world in terms of its military power, its natural resources, the size of its population, the technology that it has. And I think that's where the Americans have gone terribly wrong in the last 30 years, because they got used to considering Russia as some sort of a wasted country, no man's land, which can be broken up. I mean, how many American statesmen or politicians have repeated this famous sentence? You know, Russia is just a country with it's a gas pump, you know, and a gas pump with a flag. And that was the general popular view of Russia. You know, it has an economy the size of Spain or Texas. So how can you take such a country seriously? You know, it's frozen half of the year, and Putin is a sort of a crazy man ruling alone in the Kremlin. Actually, the reality is very different. Just to talk about the Russian government, you can call it undemocratic by Western standards. That's an issue that is highly debatable, because we all know that Western governments can also be highly undemocratic in the way they do certain things. But the fact is that Russia is ruled by a group of people, maybe a large group of people. Putin is the first among them, but he often lets decisions be taken by the experts he trusts. And therefore, the operations of the war have not been led by Putin on the telephone. You know, he knows that he's not a military man. He has let the generals decide pretty much what they thought should be done to achieve the goals. And when it was realized it was said by the Duma, the Russian parliament, that the generals who were in charge until now were just not delivering, then there was a change in the command structure. And that's where this new general has been appointed, who means business, and who is not going to get the Ukrainians get away with nonsense. And he's going to basically tell them, now it's either you settle or else you'll have to capitulate, you know. And basically that's the goal they are pursuing. And if you ask me about Putin, from what I know of certain sources that are close to him, he's actually quite careful and prudent, and he was reluctant. He was in fact opposed for a long time to starting the military operations. He kept trying to say, let's have some more talks and diplomacy. And that's why he had all these talks with Western leaders. I mean, he and Macron, the French president, must have talked for 100 hours in the last, 9 months, you know, even before February. And yet, in the end, nothing happened, because Putin realized that Macron had no power to decide anything. I mean, Macron was part of NATO, and as such, he had to defer to the American perspective. And therefore, even Putin told him, you know, it's all very good to tell me your opinion, but what can you do about it? Nothing. You're just telling me to do what the Americans want, you know, surrender to their desires, and I cannot do that. So you see, the situation is much more nuanced. You are dealing with a group of people, some of whom are much harder line than Putin is personally. And therefore, you can also expect Putin to be very often more of a moderating agent, rather than depicting him as a madman who is running the place like Stalin, and who basically is self-destructive and suicidal. I mean, you have heard everything. The British published in the news that Putin was dying or dead, and that they had put some, figure to impersonate him. And of course, all this is nonsense. I mean, if you are going to judge heads of state by their appearance, then Putin and Biden don't make a very good comparison for Biden, because you can hear Putin speak and he always makes perfect sense. And you can't say that about Biden most of the time. So, let's be honest. The West has been very, boastful and chauvinistic, and claiming that they are superior to the Russians because they are democratic, clever, rich, everything. And in fact, the situation is very different, because the West is actually on the brink of bankruptcy through over indebtedness, and Russia, from many criteria, is doing far better, in the sense that the Russian economy is far more resilient, even if it's turning into a war economy. It is far more resilient as far as the basics, the necessities are concerned, and also the sources of income, and even the currency. I mean, the Russians have got a very strong currency because it's backed by real things. American dollars are just printed in the trillions without any basis anymore. It's just basically the faith that people want to give the US government and its ability to repay its debts. But we all know that this is a highly questionable prospect, because all you have to do is raise interest rates in the US by 0.5 point or 1 point, and you could have a chain of bankruptcies that would essentially bring down the Fed, the Federal Reserve. So you see, you are dealing with a very different situation than what we are told about some sort of victorious, prosperous, and stable West, which is fighting this impoverished Russia led by a crazy dictator.
the it's very ironical now where this situation we are in now. What are the next steps forward according to you? Like, will you think that again, I'm asking the question, the European Union, now the American gas prices are going to hit the sky because the Middle East has given up. So Middle East is signing up with especially Saudi Arabia and UAE. Qatar, I do not know. But the two major oil producing countries are working with Russia, Iran obviously. So what is your view on the Middle East giving a tough time to Biden?
Very clearly, Americans have lost the Middle East because you also have to include Iraq, of course, Syria, and even Egypt, which is no longer towing the American line. But if you leave alone the Middle East, or rather if you see them as part of the larger picture, you realize, and this has been said by a number of very perspicacious financial and energy analysts, they tell you, those who are honest about it, like Schaaf and I can quote many others, Hudson, they all tell you that the West is on the brink, and the world in general is on the brink of another 2008 moment, which means a massive recession, which could very well turn into a depression, such as we haven't seen since 1929. And if that is the case, then all bets are off, because the Western elites know this. And they are extremely concerned about the ability of Russia and China together to topple the US dollar from its pedestal, which is exactly what's beginning to happen. Now, naturally, you see now the dollar is rising, and all the other currencies, the rupee and the euro, are all going down. And that's why the European Union is becoming divided, because the Germans are no longer in a good position. They are in a recession, and they are in a deficit situation, which was never the case before. They are basically not able to produce and sell as much as they are buying and importing. So that leads to a complete reassessment of the European Union and its ability to survive in the current situation. And that's why you have nationalist governments coming up here and there in Europe and challenging the European leadership. Now, in the case of the dollar, because you don't have only Russia and China, which are interested in essentially removing the dollar as the peg of the global financial system, simply because a number of countries, and not only Russia and China, are being hurt by the dollar dominance, which has become dollar tyranny, because the dollar has been weaponized. And so you have countries like Japan, South Korea, the oil-producing countries, that is OPEC, and of course the European countries, all being victimized by the dollar's rise, which is crucifying their own currencies. And therefore, the natural reaction is to replace the dollar, which is what is being developed, what is being attempted, implemented right now by BRICS and Shanghai Cooperation Organization nations. The European Union is still too much enthralled to the United States to do anything serious about that, but it will come. I would expect that in 3 or 4 months, you will see European countries decoupling. If they cannot decouple the euro from the dollar, then they will, some of them may go back to their national currencies in some way. And clearly, some countries all over the world are wanting to join BRICS because they see a sort of an alternative there to the G7, which has been ruling the roost so far. So major changes are coming. And many people are saying that the Ukraine war on the ground is a sideshow. It's like a symptom of what's happening in the world, the fight between the American hegemon and its allies and the challengers. And the challengers are now pushing to end the hegemony. And Putin has said it many times, and he's not a man who speaks lightly. He speaks only when he's pretty sure that he's going to get what he wants. And he said, you know, the dollar rule is over. The United States can no longer control the world through its currency. They'll have to adjust to a different world in which their currency will be one among many, and they will have to repatriate their foreign holdings and concentrate on saving their own economy. So that is a very telling sign, which has obviously made the US ruling circles extremely worried. And I would certainly understand why they would be willing to go to almost any extent to stop that, prevent that, So war is always an option of choice if you are trying to stop something from happening that is going to be very bad for you.
No, my next show topic you already gave me: rules-based order versus international order, and we'll discuss that next time because today we are focused on one aspect. There is a lot more to speak, and I think Carpentier has a lot of other things to take care. But we will come back on this one: rule-based order versus international order, in the next show. And meanwhile, these views are generally widespread across the world, and we have to understand all aspects in the USA. And generally, we hear the American politicians saying we have to maintain American leadership. They don't say American hegemony. And so many other countries are not able to survive because a country like Haiti, country like Cuba, country like Venezuela, small countries are not able to survive because of American sanctions. So we'll come back more in detail next show. Thank you so much, Com Carpentier. So thank you so much. And for all the viewers who are watching the show, do let us know your feedback and share and let us know, and subscribe also to the channel. Namaste. Thank you.
Namaskar. Thank you.